The final programme in this collection is called There She Blows, The Legacy of Moby-Dick. Presenter Fraser Harrison traces the origins of Melville's magnum opus and looks at the contemporary image of the whale, as described by poets, musicians and artists.
It will be a strange sort of book, I fear. Blubber is blubber, you know. Though you may get oil out of it, the poetry runs as hard as sap from a frozen maple tree. And to cook the thing up, one must needs throw in a little fancy, which, from the nature of the thing, must be ungainly, as the gambols of the whales themselves. Yet I mean to give the truth of the thing, spite of this.
Those were Herman Melville's extraordinary poetic ambitions for his novel. But standing here in London's Natural History Museum, beneath the famous model of a blue whale, all 90 feet of it, one is reminded most powerfully of the vast dimensions of Moby-Dick. It is in every sense a leviathan of a book, huge, monstrous and legendary. To do justice nowadays to this encyclopedic book, we'll have to go on a voyage of our own, dropping anchor in the Inner Hebrides and swapping whale yarns with a latter-day Captain Ahab, then sailing on to meet a biologist, a musician working with whale calls, a Greenpeace activist, and an Italian novel with a whale's eye view of man. When Herman Melville died 100 years ago in September 1891, the New York Times honoured him with an obituary of just 3 lines. Ironically, his decline into obscurity began 40 years earlier, in 1851, with the publication of Moby-Dick, his greatest book and perhaps the greatest American novel of the 19th century. However, the book, if not Melville himself, is nowadays receiving its due, with English sales alone running at more than 15,000 copies a year. Some of its popularity must be the result of our perennial fascination with the whale, a fascination which brings crowds of children to stare at the model suspended above my head. No other animal carries such poignancy as a symbol of nature. Melville made use of this symbolism, but he also knew his zoology. Jeremy Cherfus is a biologist and author of The Hunting of the Whale.
Melville shipped on the Acushnet, which was a whaler out of New England, and we know that when they were becalmed in the midst of the Pacific, 2 whaleboats would often get together for what they called a gam, and the men would all go onto one boat and the officers would all go onto the other boat, and they'd chat and swap stories and all the rest of it. And on one of those gams, Melville met the son of a man who'd been shipwrecked after being attacked by a whale, and he borrowed an account of that shipwreck. The whale involved was called Moby-Dick, as in the coffee mocha, and he became something of a celebrity. I mean, he turned up all over the Pacific, and at first it's possible to believe that there was actually one pale-coloured sperm whale bull who was roving the Pacific and who was a fairly aggressive kind of bull. He did attack boats. Then Moby-Dick starts turning up in consecutive places that he couldn't possibly have swum between in the time allowed, and it's clear he's becoming something of a legend.
There she blows! There! There! She blows! She blows! Where away? On the lee beam! About 2 miles off, a school of them! Instantly all was commotion. The sperm whale blows as a clock ticks, with the same undeviating and reliable uniformity, and thereby whalemen distinguished this fish from the other tribes of his genus. "There go flukes!" was now the cry from Tashtego, and the whales disappeared.
To read Moby-Dick is to embark on a voyage from which you can never entirely return. A part of you is doomed forever to sail aboard the Pequod under the command of the one-legged, monomaniac Captain Ahab. Ishmael, the book's narrator, summed up the plot in this way. Here then was this grey-headed, ungodly old man chasing with curses a Job's whale around the world, at the head of a crew chiefly made up of mongrel renegades and castaways and cannibals. But the book is more than a novel, and far more than a sea yarn. It's a voyage of 135 chapters round Melville's rich and tormented imagination. Though bloodily anchored in the business of whaling, it's an intoxicating compound of lore, folktale, zoology and myth. Ever since Melville launched the Pequod, other writers have followed in its wake, sailing their boats in pursuit of his whale and its meaning. Among them the critics Hermione Lee at York University, Christopher Bigsby at East Anglia, and the novelist and critic Malcolm Bradbury.
I think Melville went into this book with a lot of very, very different notions in his mind, which he could never relate to each other. And one of these is the American Faust. It's the story of Ahab. Another is the story of Ishmael the Wanderer, which is a story really about himself, or a typical Melville hero, the young man trying to quest for truth, but somehow afraid that all you ever see when you seek truth is your Narcissus image in the mirror or the sea. And the result of these different notions, these different dreams, I think, is that the book is filled with contending narrative voices. There are so many speakers in this book, although it's apparently narrated by Ishmael. This is what makes it so modern, you see. This is what makes it like Ulysses or a postmodern novel. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why it does have this double reputation. On the one hand, telling a truly American epic story, but on the other hand, also being a text filled with textual secrets, with all sorts of strangenesses and duplicities which have to do with signs, with the nature of language, with the relationship between fictional invention and documentation. And it's an amazing spread of types of book. And of course, just as there are many types of whale, so the book itself is a leviathan, which is capable of multiple forms of categorization and classification.
The classification of the constituents of a chaos. Nothing less is here essayed. To grope down into the bottom of the sea, to have one's hands among the unspeakable foundations, ribs, and very pelvis of the world. This is a fearful thing. What am I, that I should essay to hook the nose of this leviathan? But I have swam through libraries and sailed through oceans. I have had to do with whales with these visible hands. I am in earnest, and I will try.
You don't see Moby-Dick, of course, until the end of the book, until the final stages of the chase. But by the time you do see Moby-Dick, you know everything you can possibly know, and far, far more, about whales and whaling and the whole history of the beast. So you have this exhaustive, encyclopedic knowledge of whaling, to a point where it becomes like a kind of practical joke. You know, you thought you wanted to know about whaling? Right. And I think there is a sort of jokiness about the whole book, which is one of its most appealing qualities. Nevertheless, when Moby-Dick does finally appear, he's completely ineffable and godlike and mysterious. And so there is this marvellous, mysterious clash between knowing everything and not knowing anything.
The American poet Charles Olson, who wrote a book called Call Me Ishmael, said the great thing about Melville was he understood the central fact of America, which is space. And I think that's absolutely right. After all, it's an immigrant culture. People went there because they wanted to escape definition. They wanted to escape those hemmed-in worlds that they came from. But of course, that lack of definition also carries its dangers, because you're treading on an invisible edge, and you find yourself in the middle of space, and there's a certain kind of terror. There's a moment in the novel when Ahab nails a gold doubloon to the mast, which has a strange sort of design on it, and Pip, the young mad cabin boy, watches as people go up to it and look at this insignia, and what he says is, I see, you see, he sees. In other words, everybody projects their own meaning, finds their own meaning in this doubloon, as they do in Moby-Dick the whale, as they do in America, because America means different things to different people. And this is a novel in which he tries to pin down America, just as he tries to harpoon a whale.
The book is often seen as an all-male story about male camaraderie and male activity. But I think that this is a misrepresentation, and maybe this is one of the reasons it's not read, because people think it's just a boy's story about whaling still. It's actually a book full of extraordinary, sensual, erotic, kind of feminine language. I don't know whether feminine is right or whether really it's homoerotic language. There's a wonderful romance between Ishmael and Queequeg where they're tucked up in bed like a honeymoon couple, a cosy, loving pair. And they have this domestic life between them, this savage and this greenhorn American whaling boy. But there's also a passionate and luxurious sensuality and eroticism in the way in which nature is described. Nature is frightening, but it's also intensely sexual and sensual. So that there are extraordinary passages where, towards the end, where the whale ship penetrates a great circle of fighting whales and comes into the quiet centre, where the mothers are feeding the whale babies and the Queequeg mistakes an umbilical cord for a harpoon line, and they see Leviathan amours in the deep. And it's very characteristic of the way that Melville works. He swims into the sentence, he basks in the sentence, he just floats about in that sentence. You don't want it ever to end. And there's a kind of hypnotic, luxurious sensuality about this, which I think is the most wonderful thing about this novel.
Another, and still stranger world met our eyes as we gazed over the side. For suspended in those watery vaults floated the forms of the nursing mothers of the whales, and those that by their enormous girth seemed shortly to become mothers. The lake was to a considerable depth exceedingly transparent, and as human infants, while suckling, will calmly and fixedly gaze away from the breast, as if leading two different lives at the same time, and while yet drawing mortal nourishment, be still spiritually feasting upon some unearthly reminiscence, even so did the young of these whales seem looking up towards us, but not at us, as if we were but a bit of gulf-weed in their newborn sight. One of these little infants, that from certain queer tokens seemed hardly a day old, might have measured some 14 feet in length and some 6 feet in girth. The delicate side fins and the palms of his flukes still freshly retained the plaited, crumpled appearance of a baby's ears newly arrived from foreign parts.
There are precious few great whales left nowadays, and no Moby-Dicks. Far from being an unconquerable Leviathan, lurking in his own fathomless world, biding his measureless time before leaping into our world to punish our sins, the whale, even the mighty sperm whale, is now no more than our victim. Threatened in his deepest retreat by our explosives and poisons, the whale has been turned into a symbol of our destructiveness and the exquisite vulnerability of nature. This idea of the whale possessing a sensibility subtler than ours has been artfully used by the contemporary Italian author Antonio Tabucci in his story of sperm whaling in the Azores. The Woman of Porto Pim ends with a postscript.
A whale's view of man. Always so feverish, and with those long limbs waving about. Not rounded at all, so they don't have the majesty of complete rounded shapes sufficient unto themselves, but little moving heads, where all their strange life seems to be concentrated. They arrive sliding across the sea, but not swimming, and they bring death with frailty and graceful ferocity. They're silent for long periods, but then shout at each other with unexpected fury, a tangle of sounds that hardly vary and don't have the perfection of our basic cries, the call, the love cry, the death lament. And how pitiful their love-making must be, without a soft covering of fat, made easy by their thread-like shape, which excludes the heroic difficulties of union and the magnificent and tender efforts to achieve it. Like us, they travel in herds, but they don't bring their females. They don't like water, they're afraid of it, and it's hard to understand why they bother with it.
The findings of a population census conducted in the southern hemisphere a couple of years ago suggested that the sperm whales in the southern oceans had been wiped out by some 99% from a population estimated at about 1 million to 10,000 animals or less. And this, I'm afraid to say, is sadly representative of all the large or great whale species that have been the targets of the commercial whaling industry.
Andy Ottaway is wildlife campaigner with Greenpeace UK, the originators and beneficiaries of the Save the Whale campaign, and most famous for placing themselves between whale and harpoon in the killing seas.
The last sperm whale killed in the world was in the Azores in 1987, so in the subsequent years that's the first time in some 200 to 300 years that Moby-Dick himself, the sperm whale, is actually living in peace with humanity.
The recent PR that the whale has had hasn't actually, it's done the whale a favour in that it's alerted people to what magnificent beasts they are, but it hasn't really been a very accurate portrayal of whales. Most whales, and the sperm whale is an exception, they're grazing animals. They're the cows of the ocean. They're not that intelligent. They've got big brains because they've got big bodies. The sperm whale is slightly different. It's much more of a carnivore, of a hunter itself. It plunges down to the depths and then lurks around waiting for giant squid and octopuses and jellyfish to eat. So the sperm whale is slightly different. But basically, I think Melville's picture of the whale as an animal, never mind about the malevolence of Moby-Dick, is a more accurate picture than the picture we're getting today of these sort of superconscious beings wandering the planet looking for peace and love, and that's not true.
Jeremy Cherfas offers the salutary scepticism of a biologist. However, even if they are only cows of the ocean, it's worth recalling the scale of the beast we're dealing with. In Moby-Dick, Ishmael measures a whale's skeleton and calculates that the living animal must have been 90 feet long and at least 16 feet deep. Thus a mature whale was like a row of cottages, frolicking in the brine. In the days of relatively small sailing ships, these monsters were doubly fearsome because of their ability to spring so murderously from water to air, much as our cottages might suddenly stand upright and bite a passing plane. Nonetheless, today's whale is seen no longer as a beast, but a poet. Tim Wheater played his flute to humpback whales in Platypus Bay, Australia.
What actually occurred is quite extraordinary in its way, because I'd always had this idea, really, that whales would be responsive to music, because for this fundamental fact they make their own. And so I was curious to do this experiment where I would play a live music, i.e. a flute, and I took along a didgeridoo player, a natural instrument of Australia, which I thought was quite appropriate as well. We then started playing music, and this was quite a wondrous and miraculous experience for me, and quite life-changing in its way, I must add. The whales responded quite magnificently, in a way, to the music. They first of all circled the boat and then came right under it, and then slowly they came right out of the water in front of us, surfacing, as though in response to the sounds we made, and just letting their air whoosh out of their blowholes. I think at that point, what one plays musically to them comes very naturally. It's almost, let's say, one's own heart, one's own eyes, one's own soul speaking, and you just make music from those dimensions of your own consciousness. And it's nothing complicated. You're not going to go out and perhaps play a Bach aria or something like this. You perhaps make music that's just from you. It's a very simple means of a human communicating with a fellow mammal who happens to be a whale in the ocean. And that's how I approached it, really. And it seemed to work.
I'm on the Alpha Beta at the moment, sailing. We've sailed out of Mull this morning, Mull in Scotland, and we're now on the high seas. There's quite a swell, and we're looking for whales, minke whales. This is one of the only places in Britain you can stand a reasonable chance of seeing a minke whale. Of course, they're hunted now by a few renegade Japanese ships, but otherwise they are protected, and we're hoping to see one today. There's a party of people here from the Whale and Dolphin Conservation Society, and they're up on an observation deck above under the command of Captain Richard Fairburns, and he's explained to them what they have to do. This brings us close, of course, to the old whaling practices, the sort of thing that was actually being done on the Pequod, Melville ship, because they have to quarter the ocean. Each person's given a bit of the ocean to look at, and they're under instructions that if they see a fin, they have to bang on the deck, which will bring him along to have a look and see what they've found. And as a reward, instead of a doubloon, which Captain Ahab nailed to the mast of the Pequod, they've got a Mars bar there, tied to the radio mast, and so far no one's claimed it. Unlike Captain Ahab, whose leg was bitten off by Moby-Dick and replaced with an ivory one, our captain today, Captain Fairburns, has both his original legs intact. But in other respects, I think maybe he shares something with Captain Ahab, because he is quite devoted to the search for whales, now of course for scientific observational purposes, and no one here is armed with a harpoon, they're all armed with cameras.
Seeing whale on the screen is one thing, but actually coming face to face, as we do out here, coming face to face with these animals is something quite staggering. I've been seeing them now for 3 years, and it never ceases to excite me. They're such wonderful, majestic, graceful creatures, and they're so unafraid of us. That in a way is rather frightening. They come to us rather than us going to them. They come and look at us, they come and play with us, and I'm sure they're communicating with us. Is everybody in their stations?
Well, apparently Minke has been sighted, and we're just now looking very eagerly for the fin which will break the surface.
Now, if somebody keeps watching down here, underwater, start seeing them appear any second.
Now, apparently we've got 2 whales, possibly a juvenile, and they're very close to the boat now, 50 metres away. Just see this rolling motion of the fin just suddenly appearing, breaking the surface.
And again, coming towards us, straight towards us. Everybody stay very still now, please. A little bit of luck, they may just come and associate with you. Yes, he's coming, straight for us.
Just waiting to see how close it will come. I don't want to be reminded too closely of the book at this stage. I don't want to be rammed.
Here he is.
It's suddenly surfaced within, 25 metres, I suppose. With a little blowing noise. It is literally playing about under the hull of the boat. We are the observed, not the observers at this point. Just gently wandering past us, yes. Walking pace almost. There it comes, broken the surface of the water, blown, fin disappeared. A little spray there. It's gone underneath again.
There she breaches! There she breaches! In his immeasurable bravados, the white whale tossed himself salmon-like to heaven, so suddenly seen in the blue plain of the sea, and relieved against the still bluer margin of the sky. The spray that he raised for the moment intolerably glittered and glared like a glacier, and stood there gradually fading and fading away from its first sparkling intensity to the dim mistiness of an advancing shower in a vale. "Aye, breach your last to the sun, Moby-Dick," cried Ahab. "Thy hour and thy harpoon are at hand. Down, down, all of ye, but one man at the fore. The boats, stand by!"
To write a great book is, alas, no guarantee of recognition, far less of happiness. The failure of Moby-Dick was followed the year after by the failure of Pierre, Melville's next novel, and his remaining literary reputation was all but destroyed. Though he remained prolific, he worked for the rest of his life in relative obscurity, serving 20 years as a customs inspector in New York. Indeed, Billy Budd, his best-known book after Moby-Dick, wasn't published until 1924, long after his death. There was something obscure, too, about his personality during those melancholy later years, as if he had withdrawn into a remote inner depth. The Ishmael in him drowned after all. Christopher Bigsby.
It's astonishing, I think, to realise just how relatively unsuccessful and also to some degree unknown Melville was. The early books, the South Sea books, Taipei and Omu, they did sell quite well, being largely, I think, misread as simple travelogue. But with every successive book, they sold fewer. In the course of 40 years of writing, he made $1,000, an average of $25 a year. And after the main flood of his novels, suddenly a staunching of creative output. And for 30 years odd, from about 1859, he wrote no prose fiction. He withdrew into the custom house and lived as though he had never written books like Moby-Dick. It seems absolutely astonishing that that could have happened, and it is unimaginable that Moby-Dick should not have been perceived as probably the greatest novel to have come out of America in that 100 years.
He knew very well what he was doing. He writes a letter to Hawthorne while he's writing the novel and says, "Though I wrote the Gospels in this century, I should die in the gutter." He knew that, he had no audience amongst the sort of practical, hard-headed American reading public. But now, I don't think the general public is reading Moby-Dick, and I think it's a great pity because there's probably still this misapprehension that it's a sort of American whaling yarn. If people knew and could be persuaded again that it was like The Name of the Rose or Flaubert's Parrot, that it was a great, playful, pre-postmodernist work, then maybe it could have another life.
Do you love brandy? A hogshead of brandy, then, to the best man. Come, why don't some of ye burst the blood vessel? Who's that been dropping an anchor overboard? We don't budge an inch. We're becalmed. Hello, here's grass growing in the boat's bottom, and by the Lord, the mast there's budding. This won't do, boys. The short and the long of it is, men, will ye spit fire or not? Ah, see the suds he makes. What a hump! Oh, do pile on the beef. Lays like a log. Oh, my lads, do spring. Slapjacks and quahogs for supper, my lads. Baked clams and muffins. Ho, do spring. Here's 100-barreler. Don't lose him now. Don't. Oh, don't. Oh, won't you pull for your duff, me lads? Such a sog. Such a sogger. Don't you love sperm? Ha! There goes $3,000, men! A bank! A whole bank! The Bank of England! Oh, do!
He's writing an autobiography, in a way. He's writing about how he feels to be alive and to be a writer. So one of the things that he does is to make little forays into the book under cover of the name of Ishmael. So Call Me Ishmael in itself is a kind of joke. You might just well have said Call Me Herman. My favourite one of these chapter endings is where he suddenly starts telling you about how difficult it is to write this book. He's talking about cytology and, what a lot there is to say about the science of whaling. And this is how he ends chapter 32. Finally, it was stated at the outset that this system would not be here and at once perfected. You cannot but plainly see that I have kept my word. But I now leave my cetological system standing thus unfinished, even as the great cathedral of Cologne was left, with the crane still standing upon the top of the uncompleted tower. For small erections may be finished by their first architects. Grand ones, true ones, ever leave the copestone to posterity. God keep me from ever completing anything. This whole book is but a draught, nay, but the draught of a draught. O time, strength, cash, and patience. And it could be, the elegy for all great writers. O time, strength, cash, and patience.
Melville's Moby-Dick has become part of our folklore and even our pop music. His name known to thousands of people who have never read the book and never heard of Melville either. But though Moby-Dick is recognisably a real sperm whale and related to our generation of beleaguered and protected whales, he is not to be reduced to natural history. He is a white, not a green whale. He is a fictional being, an imaginary monster, and his power is undiminished. Moby-Dick is the sea dragon that swims at the bottom of your mind, hunted by the Ahab of your obsessions. On the other hand, ecology has added another layer of symbolic blubber to his bulk, for Moby-Dick serves to remind us that nature possesses a defensive power which, if roused, will destroy us. It is Captain Ahab's malignity that turns the whale malign. The more we harry nature, the more certain we render our destruction. There will always be a Moby-Dick waiting to bite off our leg, crush our boat, and if we persist, sink our ship.
That was There She Blows, The Legacy of Moby-Dick. It was presented by Fraser Harrison, with Kerry Shale reading from Moby-Dick. The producer